Comrades, you have been taught that power rules because it is chosen. You have been told that authority stands because it is legitimate. You have been persuaded that the system endures because the people consent. But I tell you this, power does not ask for permission. It manufactures it. Power does not knock at the door of the working class and humbly request obedience. It builds the house, owns the door, writes the law that defines trespass, and then calls its domination order. It creates the conditions of your survival and then names your dependents freedom. Look around you. Ask yourselves, who owns the land, the factories, the machines, the digital platforms, the banks? Who controls the production of food, shelter, medicine, information? Is it the many who labor or the few who accumulate? In every epoch, the ruling ideas have been nothing more than the ideas of the ruling class. This was not an accident, it was a design. Power maintains itself not by constant violence, though violence is always waiting in the shadows, but by organizing society in such a way that exploitation appears natural. It convinces the worker that wages are generosity, that employment is a privilege, that survival is a reward for obedience. The worker sells labor power not because he is free, but because he has been separated from the means of production. His freedom is the freedom to choose his master. This separation, this great historical theft, is the foundation of modern power. In earlier times, chains were visible. Today, they are economic. The peasant once knew the lord who taxed him. The modern worker knows only the market, that abstract tyrant that rises and falls like a god without a face. But the market is no deity. It is a social relation between classes, disguised as fate. Under capitalism, power maintains itself through three great instruments: ownership, ideology, and division. First, ownership. The capitalist class does not need to rule every parliament directly. It rules through property. Whoever owns the means of production commands the labor of others. Laws are written to protect property before people. Courts defend contracts before children. The state, which pretends to stand above society, in truth safeguards the conditions necessary for capital to reproduce itself. It does not ask your permission. It asks whether profit is secure. Bourgeois. Second, ideology. You are told that inequality is the result of talent, that poverty is the result of laziness, that billionaires are innovators and workers are fortunate beneficiaries of their genius. This narrative is repeated in schools, media, and even in the language of politics. Competition is celebrated, solidarity is mocked. Success is individualized, suffering is privatized. Thus the exploited blame themselves instead of the system. The worker who cannot pay rent thinks he has failed. The graduate drowning in debt believes she chose poorly. The laborer without health care imagines he did not work hard enough. This is how power maintains itself, by colonizing consciousness. When the oppressed internalize the logic of their oppressors, rebellion appears irrational. A third, division. Power thrives by fragmenting the working class, by race, by nationality, by religion, by gender, by trade. It whispers to one worker that another is the enemy. It convinces the employed to resent the unemployed, the citizen to fear the immigrant, the skilled to despise the unskilled. While the many quarrel over crumbs, the few feast upon the harvest of their collective labor. Understand this clearly. The capitalist does not profit from your hatred of your neighbor. He profits from your separation from him. Unity is dangerous to power because unity reveals truth. When workers recognize that their conditions are shared, that their exploitation is systemic, that their poverty is not personal but political, then power trembles. Economic crises expose this truth with merciless clarity. When markets collapse, when factories close, when banks demand rescue, the illusion of stability shatters. Suddenly, governments that preached austerity for the poor discover abundance for the rich. Public funds flow upward. Losses are socialized. Profits remain private. And yet you are told this is necessary, responsible, inevitable. No, it is structural. Power maintains itself by ensuring that even its failures reinforce its dominance. Crisis becomes opportunity for consolidation, for privatization, for deeper control. The worker loses employment, the corporation gains subsidy, the family loses a home, the bank gains an asset. Thus exploitation renews itself, but there is one force power cannot permanently suppress: class consciousness. When the worker understands that labor is the source of all value, that without collective effort not a wheel would turn, nor a light would shine, then the myth of capitalist indispensability dissolves. The capitalist does not produce wealth, he appropriates it. He does not create value, he extracts surplus from the labor of others. Imagine comrades, the realization, spreading like flame that the factories belong to those who work them, that the land belongs to those who cultivate it, that technology belongs to those who build and maintain it. Imagine the worker no longer begging for wages but asserting ownership. Imagine production organized not for profit but for need. Power will not surrender this world voluntarily. It never has. It will speak of chaos, of instability, of danger. It will deploy laws, police, and propaganda. But remember, its strength lies in your compliance. Its continuity rests upon your labor. Withdraw that labor, organize it, unify it, direct it, and the foundations of exploitation begin to crack. This is not a call for reckless fury, it is a call for organized transformation. Trade unions, cooperatives, political movements, these are not mere institutions, they are the embryos of a new society. Every act of solidarity chips away at the myth that competition is natural. Every strike declares that human dignity outweighs profit. Power maintains itself without asking for permission because it has structured society to make permission irrelevant. Therefore, we must restructure society to make exploitation impossible. Let us be clear. The goal is not to invert oppression, to replace one ruling class with another. The goal is to abolish class domination itself, to create a society in which the free development of each is the condition F, or the free development of all. History is not neutral. It is the history of class struggles. The question is not whether change will come, but who will shape it. Will it be those who hoard wealth and defend privilege, or will it be those whose hands build the world? Comrades, power has never asked your permission. It has taken your time, your labor, your dreams. The hour has come to withdraw your consent, not as isolated individuals, but as a united class conscious of its strength. You are not powerless. You are the producers of all power. Organize, educate, agitate, and let the world built without your permission be remade by your collective will. Power sustains itself not through the consent of those it governs, but through a carefully constructed system of ownership, ideology, and division that ensures its perpetuation across generations. At the most visible level, ownership confers control over the very means by which life is sustained. Those who own land, factories, resources, and technology hold the capacity to direct the labor of others and determine the distribution of goods and services. Ownership is not a neutral condition. It is a concentrated instrument of authority. The capitalist, for example, may claim to participate in markets voluntarily, but this voluntary exchange is itself predicated on the worker's lack of access to the instruments of production. The worker must sell labor to survive, while the owner of capital can extract surplus value without direct engagement in physical toil. This creates a structural imbalance in which the capacity to decide, to innovate, and to benefit materially is concentrated in the hands of the few, leaving the many dependent on them. Property thus becomes both shield and sword. A shield for the wealthy to protect accumulated resources, and a sword to enforce compliance from those who possess nothing but their labor power. The laws, the state institutions, and even the judicial frameworks are constructed to defend this ownership. Courts protect property rights more rigorously than they protect human needs. The state, which pretends to stand above social conflicts, exists primarily to enforce these rights. Through ownership, power creates a social hierarchy that appears natural and inevitable. Yet ownership alone is insufficient to maintain power indefinitely. To secure domination, power must also control consciousness. Ideology is the subtle and persistent tool by which people are persuaded to internalize the conditions of their subjugation. Workers are told that their wages are generous, that social mobility is possible for those who try hard enough, that inequality is the natural consequence of talent and effort. These narratives are disseminated through education, media, and cultural institutio. Ends producing what seems to be a voluntary acceptance of the existing order. The worker who struggles to survive in precarious employment is encouraged to believe in personal failure rather than structural exploitation. The unemployed are told they lack the skills or motivation to succeed, while the wealthy are lauded as innovators or visionaries. Ideology masks exploitation, making it appear as a choice or a meritocratic result, rather than the outcome of a deliberate system designed to extract labor and value from the majority. In this way, ideology functions as a mechanism of consent without the necessity of explicit coercion. People may even defend the very system that oppresses them, internalizing its logic and replicating its narratives. The control of thought ensures that power is not only maintained through visible instruments of coercion, but also through the shaping of beliefs, desires, and expectations, producing a population that is complicit in its own subordination. Division is the third pillar of power's persistence. The ruling class benefits whenever the working class is fragmented, pitted against itself by artificial distinctions. Differences of race, nationality, gender, religion, occupation, or skill are emphasized and weaponized to prevent solidarity. One worker is taught to envy or distrust another, to see peers as competitors rather than allies. Immigrants are vilified as threats to employment, the unemployed are disparaged as lazy, and disputes between skilled and unskilled laborers are amplified. Through division, the collective potential of the laboring class is weakened. Fragmentation ensures that rebellion is less likely and that workers expend energy policing each other instead of confronting the structures that exploit them. The capitalist thrives in this environment because separation allows the accumulation of wealth and authority without resistance. Division reinforces ideology, making it easier for individuals to internalize narratives of meritocracy, competition, and individual responsibility. Fragmented populations are less able to recognize their shared interests and are therefore more easily governed. Together, ownership, ideology, and division form a self-reinforcing system. Ownership provides the material means to enforce compliance. Ideology secures psychological consent. and division prevents organized resistance. Each pillar alone could exert influence, but together they ensure that power endures without needing permission. The worker labors because property dictates it, believes in the righteousness of inequality because ideology instructs it, and remains isolated from potential allies because division enforces it. The system reproduces itself not because people submit consciously, but because every structural Raul element discourages resistance and naturalizes exploitation. Economic crises, social upheavals, and political instability may momentarily challenge the appearance of stability, but the underlying mechanisms of ownership, ideology, and division are resilient. They adapt, recalibrate, and maintain the dominance of the few over the many. The continuity of power is thus a product of deliberate organization, not voluntary obedience. Power, in this sense, is an invisible architecture that shapes lives and choices while remaining largely unquestioned. Ownership ensures control over resources, ideology secures control over consciousness, and division weakens the collective strength of the majority. These elements operate simultaneously, creating a society in which compliance is embedded in the very structure of existence. The mechanisms of control are not always seen, but they are always felt, guiding the behavior, decisions, and understanding of those who inhabit the system. Through these intertwined strategies, power sustains itself indefinitely, without asking for permission, without needing explicit consent, and without relying on the voluntary submission of those it dominates. Ownership, ideology, and division are thus not merely aspects of power, they are its lifeblood, its strategy, and its guarantee. They shape society in ways that appear natural, moral, and inevitable, masking the deliberate construction of hierarchy and exploitation. Those who labor, consume, and exist within these structures often perceive the conditions as immutable, failing to recognize the systemic organization that produces and maintains inequality. Each day, these mechanisms operate invisibly, shaping consciousness, determining opportunities, and fragmenting potential resistance. They create a world in which the laborer, the student, the citizen believes that participation in the system is both necessary and voluntary. But in reality, these forces are the chains by which power moves, reproduces, and preserves itself. The persistence of power without permission demonstrates the sophistication of modern domination. It is not brute force alone that ensures the continuity of authority, it is the careful integration of material control, ideological conditioning, and social fragmentation. Power does not wait for consent, because it has already organized society to make consent irrelevant. Through ownership, it structures dependency. Through ideology, it structures belief. Through division, it structures isolation. Together, these forces secure a society in which the many labor for the benefit of the few, not through explicit coercion, but through mechanisms so pervasive and insidious that they appear natural and necessary. Ownership allows the few to dictate conditions. Ideology convinces the many to accept them, and division prevents collective challenge. In this way, power sustains itself continuously, subtly, and effectively without ever needing to ask, request, or negotiate permission. Economic inequality is not a product of chance, luck, or the moral failings of individuals. It is a structural feature of the system in which we live, embedded deeply in the mechanisms of production, distribution, and social organization. From the earliest moments of industrial capitalism to the complex financial systems of the modern world, inequality has been manufactured and maintained by institutions designed to concentrate wealth and control resources in the hands of a few while relegating the majority to positions of dependence and vulnerability. It is a system in which labor produces value, yet ownership dictates its allocation, and the worker rarely receives more than a fraction of what they have created. Those who prosper are often lauded for personal brilliance or ambition, while those who struggle are blamed for laziness, lack of skill, or poor choices. This narrative of personal failure obscures the systemic forces that determine outcomes long before any individual action can take effect. At the heart of systemic economic inequality lies the control of the means of production. The factories, farms, technology, and financial institutions that produce wealth are owned by a small segment of society. Ownership is not merely a question of legal title. It is a source of social power. Those who possess the means of production dictate wages, working conditions, and the distribution of surplus. The worker who produces the wealth must sell their labor simply to survive. Their dependence is not a moral deficit, but a structural inevitability created by the very arrangement of production. The capitalist, on the other hand, profits not from individual effort, but from the extraction of surplus labor. This extraction is not arbitrary. It is codified in law, reinforced by institutions, and normalized by ideology. Thus, inequality is baked into the economic system itself, not the result of the individual talents or failings of the worker. Education, often presented as a path to social mobility, also reflects and reproduces systemic inequality rather than correcting it. Access to quality education is heavily influenced by wealth, geography, and social networks. Children born into affluent families receive resources, guidance, and opportunities that children from poorer backgrounds cannot easily obtain. While meritocracy is celebrated as the natural order, the reality is that structural advantages and disadvantages predetermine outcomes. Scholarships, loans, and elite institutions may offer the appearance of upward mobility, but they do no. Dismantle the broader inequalities in resource distribution, social capital, and inherited privilege. The system rewards those already positioned to succeed and penalizes those structurally disadvantaged, giving the illusion that inequality is a product of personal choice rather than systemic design. Labor markets themselves are structured to maintain disparities. Wages, job security, and benefits are not simply determined by productivity or skill. They are shaped by the power imbalance between employer and employee, the availability of labor, and the imperatives of profit accumulation. A worker may toil for decades, yet the bulk of the wealth they generate is appropriated by those who control the enterprise. Meanwhile, economic structures such as tax policies, corporate subsidies, and property rights are engineered to favor capital accumulation over labor compensation. This institutional design ensures that inequality persists even in the absence of overt corruption or malfeasance, demonstrating that it is systemic rather than incidental. Social narratives further entrench inequality by framing it as natural or deserved. The idea that the wealthy are industrious and deserving, while the poor are idle and culpable for their situation, is a powerful ideological tool that diverts attention from systemic causation. Media, cultural discourse, and educational curricula propagate these myths, shaping consciousness in ways that make inequality seem justified. When people internalize these narratives, they may blame themselves or their peers for circumstances created by structural forces beyond their control. This internalization not only perpetuates inequality, but also undermines collective resistance, making it less likely that workers will organize to challenge the system that exploits them. Globalization and technological change have further intensified systemic inequality. Wealth and resources are concentrated in global networks controlled by multinational corporations and financial institutions. Workers in one part of the world are pitted against those in another, and the competition is framed as merit-based or market-driven. Yet these conditions are orchestrated by policies and structures designed to benefit capital and disadvantage labor. Automation and technological innovation, while productive, often exacerbate disparities by displacing workers and increasing the returns to those who own the machines or the intellectual property. Inequality is reproduced at every level, not because individuals fail, but because systems are designed to distribute value unevenly. Economic inequality also manifests in access to health, housing, and security. Those with wealth can afford better medical care, safe neighborhoods, and the means to mitigate risks, where the majority struggle to secure basic needs. These disparities are not accidental. They reflect the structural allocation of resources that prioritizes profit over human welfare. Policies that regulate access to housing, healthcare, and public goods often reinforce existing inequalities, ensuring that systemic advantage continues across generations. In political terms, systemic economic inequality ensures that those with wealth also wield influence over decision-making. Lobbying, campaign financing, and institutional representation favor the interests of the affluent, creating a feedback loop in which policies reinforce economic disparities. The poor are excluded, not because they lack ability or insight, but because structures are in place to privilege the wealthy. Democracy and meritocracy function within this framework as mechanisms that legitimize inequality rather than challenge it. Inequality is thus embedded in the architecture of society. It is reproduced through ownership, labor relations, education, ideology, social policy, and global economic arrangements. To view it as the result of individual failure is to misunderstand the mechanisms that produce it. Economic disparities are neither accidental nor random. They are the logical consequence of a system designed to concentrate wealth, control resources, and structure opportunity according to class, status, and access. Those who suffer are not failing personally. They are subjected to a system that predetermines their position, while those who prosper do so because they are positioned within a structure that favors accumulation over equitable distribution. Systemic inequality is not simply a feature of modern society. It is the result of deliberate social organization that sustains and reproduces itself over time. It is codified in law, legitimized by ideology, and enforced by institutions that maintain the imbalance between labor and capital, the many and the few, the marginalized and the privileged. Those who understand this can begin to see that personal failure is not the cause of poverty, exploitation, or marginalization, but rather the consequence of structures designed to produce and perpetuate economic inequality across generations. Class consciousness is the awareness of one's position within the structures of production and social hierarchy, and it represents the most profound challenge to entrenched power because it exposes the fundamental contradictions upon which domination rests. Those who rule do not rely solely on force. They rely on the ignorance and fragmentation of those they govern. The worker may toil endlessly, produce immense wealth, and sustain the very society that oppresses them, yet remain unaware of the systemic relations that govern their existence. It is, too, the cultivation of consciousness, the understanding that exploitation is not individual, accidental, or unavoidable, that threatens to dismantle these relations. When workers recognize that their labor is the source of all value, that the surplus extracted by the few enriches them at the expense of the many. They begin to see themselves not as isolated individuals competing for survival, but as members of a collective whose power has been systematically suppressed. Without class consciousness, the structures of power remain largely unchallenged because they are internalized. Ideologies of meritocracy, competition, and individual responsibility convince the majority that their suffering is self-inflicted or justified. Workers blame themselves for unemployment, debt, or inadequate wages, rather than recognizing the systemic extraction that produces these conditions. The ruling class, therefore, depends on this lack of awareness to maintain the status quo. But the moment consciousness awakens, the very foundation of domination becomes precarious. The worker begins to question why their labor enriches others while leaving them precarious. The farmer recognizes that their toil sustains markets that profit intermediaries rather than the cultivator. The factory laborer sees that machines and capital are tools not of liberation but of extraction, the recognition that the system is designed to serve the interests of a minority erodes the legitimacy of authority, revealing that inequality is structural, not natural. Class consciousness is not merely intellectual recognition, it is social and relational. It emerges as workers begin to identify shared conditions, common grievances, and collective interests. When people recognize that exploitation is systemic and not the result of personal failure, solidarity becomes possible. Shared understanding produces collective will. Workers discover that their power lies not in isolated effort, but in their ability to coordinate action. Strikes, unions, cooperatives, and political movements are all expressions of this consciousness in practice. The threat to entrenched power is not just in individual knowledge, but in organized knowledge, the transformation of awareness into collective capacity. This is why ruling elites fear education, independent media, and any forum in which the oppressed might recognize their shared interests. Knowledge of one's social position is a weapon against domination. History demonstrates the potency of class consciousness. Revolutions, uprisings, and social movements are rarely spontaneous. They emerge when groups of people recognize their collective conditions, the source of their oppression, and the means by which they might alter it. The capitalist state, aware of this danger, deploys ideological apparatuses to suppress consciousness. Education, media, cultural institutions, and even legal frameworks are designed to instill division, promote individualism, and obscure the structural causes of inequality. By fragmenting the working class along lines of race, gender, nationality, or skill, power ensures that consciousness is delayed or diluted. Workers may recognize their suffering but perceive it as unique or unconnected to others, weakening the potential for collective mobilization. Therefore, the cultivation of class consciousness is inherently subversive because it counters these divisions and illuminates the systemic nature of exploitation. The development of class consciousness also challenges the notion that change must come from above. Power is accustomed to reforms that are granted, policies that are negotiated, and concessions that maintain the appearance of control. Yet, when the working class organizes with awareness of its collective strength, it shifts the locus of change from rulers to the ruled. Authority no longer dictates terms unilaterally. It is confronted by a population capable of asserting its interests collectively. The ruling class fears this because it threatens not only material control, but ideological dominance. Once consciousness spreads, the moral justification for inequality, once taken for granted, collapses. The worker no longer accepts the narrative that the distribution of wealth is fair or deserved. They see it for what it is, the result of calculated appropriation and exploitation. Class consciousness also has the potential to restructure social relations. Once the many recognize the structural logic of inequality, they can begin to envision alternatives. Cooperative production, collective ownership of resources, and democratic management of labor become conceivable. These alternatives are threatening precisely because they make power without permission obsolete. The ruling elite can tolerate obedience and fragmentation, but cannot survive a conscious, organized population aware of its collective power. Workers recognize that their labor is not a commodity to be bought and sold for the enrichment of others, but the source of all social wealth, and that liberation requires control over production, distribution, and governance itself. The emergence of class consciousness, therefore, represents an existential threat to entrenched power because it undermines both the structural and ideological pillars of domination. Ownership of capital, manipulation of belief, and division among the exploited all rely on ignorance and disunity. When consciousness spreads, these pillars weaken simultaneously. Workers no longer internalize their subordination. They no longer compete against each other blindly, and they begin to claim the value they produce collectively. Awareness transforms potential into action, and action begins to reshape the structures of society. Consciousness is not passive. It is inherently mobilizing. It produces questions, critiques, and strategies for intervention. The worker who understands exploitation begins to organize, educate peers, and assert demands. Solidarity emerges not as sentiment but as strategy, and collective action becomes both inevitable and effective. The ruling class, which depends on division and ignorance, confronts a population capable of self-organization, capable of redirecting labor and resources according to need rather than private accumulation. Class consciousness illuminates the true architecture of society, exposing the mechanisms of extraction, hierarchy, and control. It transforms passive suffering into active challenge, systemic oppression into a target for resistance, and potential power into an actionable force capable of undermining entrenched domination. Unity and collective labor are the engines through which social transformation becomes possible, for the forces that dominate society depend upon the isolation and fragmentation of those they exploit. Power is never neutral. It is maintained through the systematic division of laborers, the dissemination of ideology that justifies inequality, and the concentration of resources in the and of a few. To challenge such entrenched domination requires more than individual effort, moral indignation, or isolated rebellion. It requires the conscious organization of the many into a coherent force capable of asserting its collective interests. When workers, peasants, and all who produce the wealth of society recognize that their strength lies not in individual struggle but in mutual solidarity, the structures of oppression begin to tremble. History repeatedly demonstrates that unity is not merely a strategic advantage, but the essential condition for any lasting transformation. Alone, a worker may resist injustice temporarily, but only collectively can resistance reshape the systems that perpetuate inequality. Collective labor is inseparable from unity. The production of society's wealth is already a collaborative endeavor. No individual creates the infrastructure, crops, technology, or goods that sustain communities entirely alone. Yet the fruits of this collective effort are disproportionately claimed by those who do not contribute labor, but who control the means of production. Recognition of this collective contribution is the foundation of class consciousness, and class consciousness is inseparable from solidarity. When workers organize, they convert individual labor into collective bargaining power. transforming the conditions of exploitation into opportunities for negotiation, reform, and eventually systemic change. Strikes, worker councils, cooperatives, and labor unions are practical expressions of this principle, demonstrating that when individuals unite around shared interests, they can shift the balance of power. The laborer's strength is multiplied exponentially when joined to others who share the same goals, and the illusion of individual helplessness dissolves. Unity undermines the divisions that power relies upon. The ruling class has always sought to fragment society along lines of race, nationality, gender, skill, or occupation, knowing that isolated workers are easier to dominate and exploit. Competition is emphasized over cooperation. Cultural narratives celebrate individual achievement while obscuring systemic oppression. By promoting mistrust and envy among the exploited, power ensures that collective resistance is delayed, weakened, or misdirected. Solidarity, therefore, is a revolutionary act in itself, for it defies the mechanisms of division that uphold domination. When workers see beyond artificial separations and recognize shared conditions and shared interests, they reclaim the agency that has been denied to them, forming a social force capable of challenging inequality at every level. Unity transforms numbers into power, shared labor into leverage, and collective understanding into political and economic influence. See, the practice of collective labor also generates practical knowledge and organizational skills essential for social transformation. When workers manage production collectively, coordinate strikes, or operate cooperatives, they not only challenge existing hierarchies, but also demonstrate the feasibility of alternative social arrangements. The organization required to distribute labor, resources, and decision-making fairly within a collective mirrors the organization required to govern society equitably. In these instances, unity and collective effort are not abstract ideals, but living experiments in democratic self-management, revealing that society can function without the centralized authority of a ruling elite. By participating in cooperative labor, individuals learn to negotiate, communicate, and make decisions together, fostering the habits and consciousness necessary to dismantle exploitation on a larger scale. Moreover, unity amplifies the moral and political voice of the working class. A single protest may be ignored, but coordinated action, mass mobilization, and sustained campaigns create undeniable pressure. Laws, policies, and even public opinion are more susceptible to change when a united collective asserts its interests. Historical movements from labor strikes to peasant uprisings illustrate that sustained unity can force concessions, shift power dynamics, and even catalyze revolutionary transformation. Collective labor ensures that action is purposeful, coordinated, and strategic, rather than sporadic or symbolic. When solidarity guides effort, workers can negotiate, resist, and reorganize not only production, but the very frameworks that govern economic and social life. Unity also strengthens consciousness. Individual grievances may be dismissed as personal misfortune, but shared experience and collective reflection reveal systemic patterns. When workers engage in dialogue, organize around common goals, and participate in cooperative labor, they begin to understand the structural nature of exploitation and the potential of their combined strength. Solidarity transforms perception. What once appeared inevitable or natural is now recognized as contingent and changeable. Through collective labor, individuals internalize the lesson that social transformation is neither spontaneous nor accidental, but the product of deliberate, organized action undertaken by a unified population. Economic, political, and social power all flow from the organization of labor. When workers act together, They confront the structures that rely on isolation and competition, the ability to withhold labor, to demand fair conditions, to establish autonomous systems of production, and to redistribute resources equitably is rooted in unity. Collective labor demonstrates that the wealth of society is created by the many, not the few, and that shared effort can produce shared benefit. This realization is both empowering and threatening, for it exposes the fragility of entrenched hierarchies and the possibility of a society organized around need, equity, and mutual respect, rather than accumulation, exploitation, and hierarchy. Through unity and collective labor, the oppressed can transform themselves from passive participants in a system that exploits them into active architects of a new social order. By recognizing shared interests, coordinating effort, and exercising collective power, they reclaim control over production, decision-making, and the distribution of wealth. The structures of domination, which rely on division and individualized submission, are confronted not with isolated acts of defiance, but with the coordinated, conscious effort of a united class. Solidarity transforms labor into leverage, organization into agency, and awareness into action, demonstrating that social transformation is possible when the many act together as one. True liberation cannot be achieved through the mere replacement of one set of rulers with another, for the structures of exploitation and domination are not dependent on the individuals who occupy positions of authority, but on the systemic relations that allow domination to persist. History is replete with examples where revolutions have toppled monarchs, overthrown tyrants, or replaced ruling elites. Yet the underlying mechanisms of oppression remained intact. When power remains concentrated in the hands of a few, whether inherited by birth, acquired through wealth, or seized by revolution, the conditions that produce inequality, exploitation, and alienation continue to operate. True liberation, therefore, is not the substitution of rulers, but the dismantling of class domination itself, the abolition of the social, economic, and political relations that create hierarchies of exploitation and enforced dependence. Class domination is embedded in the control of the means of production, the organization of labor, and the distribution of resources. The ruling class maintains its power not only through ownership, but through the very structure of society, which is designed to extract labor, concentrate wealth, and limit the agency of the majority. To replace one ruler with another without addressing these systemic relations is to change the face of authority while leaving the machina, while of exploitation intact. Workers may gain nominal representation and leaders may promise equality, yet unless the relations between those who produce and those who appropriate are fundamentally transformed, the new leadership will inevitably reproduce the conditions of domination. True liberation demands the abolition of the social and economic structures that allow the few to command the many, not the simple exchange of who holds formal power. Political change alone is insufficient because domination is not maintained exclusively through laws, constitutions, or governments. It is sustained through the interplay of ownership, ideology, and social hierarchies. A revolution that installs new rulers without altering the distribution of property, control over production, and the organization of labor only shifts who benefits from exploitation. The laborer continues to sell their capacity to work under conditions determined by others, and wealth remains concentrated. Ideology continues to legitimize hierarchy, inequality, and competition. The oppressed may gain new faces in positions of authority, but the systemic forces that produce oppression remain unchallenged. True liberation, in contrast, requires the restructuring of society so that ownership, production, and distribution serve the collective needs of all, not the accumulation of a few. Economic relations are central to the perpetuation of class domination. In a society structured around private property and profit, the majority labor not for their own sustenance, but for the enrichment of a minority. Exploitation is not accidental, but systemic. The value created by labor is extracted in the form of surplus and appropriated by those who control production. Political promises, new leadership, or reformist measures cannot eliminate this extraction unless the relations of production themselves are transformed. To abolish class domination is to eliminate the social mechanisms that allow one group to live from the labor of another. It is to redistribute control over resources and production so that those who produce wealth also govern its use and benefit equitably from its fruits. Class domination is also maintained through ideology which naturalizes inequality and justifies hierarchy. People are taught to accept that some are born to rule and others to obey, that wealth is earned through talent alone, and that poverty is a personal failing. Even when rulers change, these ideologies persist, shaping consciousness and behavior to reproduce the conditions of exploitation. True liberation requires a cultural and intellectual transformation in which people recognize the systemic nature of domination, understand the collective sources of their power, and reject narratives that divide and disempower them. His ideological shift, replacing leaders, does not prevent the perpetuation of oppression. It merely changes the color or name of the authority. Social hierarchies and divisions are another pillar of class domination. Rulers rely on fragmentation of the oppressed to maintain control, fostering conflict along lines of race, gender, nationality, occupation, or skill to prevent solidarity. Revolutions that replace rulers without addressing these divisions leave the population isolated, vulnerable, and unable to assert collective power. True liberation requires unifying those who labor and suffer under the system, forging solidarity across previously imposed divides, and organizing society around cooperation, equity, and mutual empowerment rather than hierarchy, competition, and domination. The essence of liberation is the collective self-determination of the majority rather than the substitution of one elite by another. It is the recognition that society's wealth, labor, and resources belong to those who create them, not to those who claim them through inherited privilege, coercion, or manipulation. It is the construction of institutions and social relations that empower people to govern themselves, manage production, and allocate resources according to need and equity. Liberation is realized not when rulers change, but when the social conditions that allow exploitation and hierarchy are abolished entirely. History shows that societies organized around class domination reproduce oppression, even under new leadership. Monarchs replaced by bureaucrats, tyrants overthrown by reformers, or revolutionary councils installed in place of old elites can all perpetuate inequality if the underlying relations of production and distribution remain unchanged. The continuity of class structures ensures that exploitation persists. Wealth remains concentrated, and the majority continues to depend on the labor of the few. Abolishing class domination, not merely replacing rulers, is therefore the revolutionary task. It requires transforming the social, economic, and political relations that allow one class to rule and another to be subjugated. To achieve true liberation, society must be reorganized to eliminate the division between those who produce and those who appropriate, to replace hierarchy with collective decision-making, and to ensure that the material and social conditions of life are accessible to all. It demands a radical restructuring of production, distribution, and governance grounded in solidarity, cooperation, and equality. This transformation is not about who occupies positions of authority, but about the abolition of the very structures that make authority over others possible. Comrades, the truth is undeniable. Power sustains itself without asking for permission. Economic inequality is built into the system. Class consciousness threatens the foundations of domination. Unity and collective labor are the engines of transformation, and true liberation cannot be achieved by merely replacing rulers. The struggle before us is not one of individual action or isolated reform. It is the struggle to dismantle the structures that concentrate wealth, extract labor, and divide the oppressed. It is the struggle to reclaim ownership of production, to awaken the collective mind, and to forge solidarity among those who create the world's wealth. Only when the working class recognizes its power, unites in purpose, and organizes collectively to abolish class domination can society be transformed. The chains of exploitation are not eternal. They persist because we have accepted them, divided ourselves, and remained unaware. Today, awareness must ignite action. Solidarity must replace division, and collective labor must become the foundation of a new world. The liberation we seek is not a handover of authority, but the creation of a society in which each person's freedom and development are bound to the freedom and development of all. History has provided the lessons, the structures of oppression have revealed themselves, and the power lies in our hands. The time is now to act, to organize, and to remake the world so that it serves the many rather than the few.